Greetings, programs, and welcome to the latest episode of Thub Wars Presents Blistered Reviews. This time around, we're taking a look at Castlevania Lords of Shadows 2. After two outings that I found rather enjoyable despite their flaws, does this game bring the sub-series to a suitable close? Keep watching to find out.
An unusual hiding place for the Prince of Darkness. I know what it is you yearn for.
I cannot die, yet I cannot live.
Help me, and I can free you of your immortality.
I stand here before you, a vampire.
Mother says that you're going to return with us. She says I shouldn't be angry with you.
It's time for you to return to us. To your family.
Only my father, Gabriel Belmont, can destroy Dracula.
Thank you for returning my heart, good sir.
I am inside of you, and your weakness will be my strength.
So the dragon still lives. We thought you dead.
If I cannot rule the world of men, then no one will!
Game over.
I am the blood that runs through your veins.
Betrayer! Now receive your just rewards for your disloyalty!
I am the dark shadow that chills the hearts of men. I am the fury, your hate and your vengeance. I am your destiny!
Say what you will about Capcom and Square Enix, but at least both companies have remained active and visible in the gaming industry. With series like Monster Hunter and Dragon Quest, they remain important players in the Japanese gaming scene, even while attempting to move forward with more Western-focused titles like Dragon's Dogma and Tomb Raider. In short, they're companies whose presence continues to be felt in a big way in the larger gaming industry, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. Sadly, the same cannot really be said about Konami, another one of the former 16-bit era greats who in the current generation have fallen decidedly far behind. The once prolific company has increasingly had to rely on a shrinking number of viable properties, with once greats like Gradius, Suikoden, Contra, Zone of the Enders, and Goemon relegated to near irrelevance or even worse, outright mothballs. And while the company has managed to still produce quality Silent Hill games in recent years, said titles have nonetheless failed to find the full commercial success they deserved with the larger gaming audience. Of course, Konami does still have the Metal Gear Solid franchise, but with the divisive Metal Gear Rising, controversial Ground Zeroes, and risky Phantom Pain, even the future of this stalwart series remains uncertain at best. And then there's Castlevania. After years of well-received handheld offerings and more dubious console spin-offs, including a fighting game outing, the less said of which the better, the series saw a major overhaul with Castlevania Lords of Shadow back in 2010. A reboot which placed players in the role of new character Gabriel Belmont, a knight operating in the year 1047, the game was a decent, if unoriginal, action-adventure title that borrowed liberally from a variety of sources, most notably the God of War franchise. Yet while its gameplay was unoriginal, and at times a little clunky, in terms of story, Lords 1 took a far riskier approach that ultimately ended with the seeming promise of a follow-up that would cast players in the role of none other than the series' longtime chief antagonist, Dracula, and in a modern-day setting to boot. This brings us to the just-released Lords of Shadow 2, a game that sadly only manages to waste both the inherent potential of its setup and any goodwill earned via its predecessors. The good. Audio, general combat. the bad. Story, controls, stealth segments, camera, visuals, ending. The ugly. No, seriously, that was one hell of an ugly ending, people. I'll be blunt. Lords of Shadow 2 is a game that manages to fail on just about every level, and a major step down from the original Lords 1. That game had its flaws to be sure, but compared to its sequel, it was practically a masterpiece. It's as if developer Mercury Steam forgot everything they learned from Lords and the side game Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate, aka Clawsmoth, and nowhere is this more true than in terms of Lords 2's story. I say story, but that's almost being too kind to the mess of poorly staged cutscenes, hideously written dialogue, and cliché plot developments that serve as this game's narrative. A narrative which, not so incidentally, builds to one of the most insultingly anticlimactic finales/endings I have seen in a big-budget game in years. This was supposed to be the grand finale of the Lords of Shadow subseries, which in and of itself is strange considering just how much hype Konami put into the original Lords as the new direction of the Castlevania franchise. But instead of moving the story forward in an exciting way that wraps everything up, Lords 2 instead simply rehashes story beats from the original, along with a sprinkling of moments almost bald-facedly stolen from the likes of the original God of War, before concluding with a half-hearted yet still infuriating semi-cliffhanger. The way Lords of Shadow 2 ends legitimately leaves me wondering if Konami took one look at what Mercury Steam was cooking up early on and came to the realization that this would be the death of the subseries, and were simply too lazy to try and put effort into fixing things. It's a real waste, especially considering that I actually really enjoyed the way the first two Lords games turned the narrative of the Castlevania franchise on its head. Speaking of wasting something that should have been fun and engaging, Lords 2's gameplay actually fares even worse than its piss-poor excuse for a story. The original Lords, as previously stated, was basically a God of War knockoff with elements from games like Zelda and Shadow of the Colossus thrown in for good measure. It was utterly familiar, yet ultimately also still enjoyable enough to help make up for its arguable lack of creativity. Lords 2 in theory continues this trend, but unfortunately does so in a manner that produces gameplay that is at best far blander than its predecessor. Combat in Lords of 2 can be fun, but that's undercut at times by loose controls and an abysmal camera system that players will often need to fight every step of the way. And even when Lords 2 does manage to do something right, it still just feels like a pale echo of other games, including the far superior Lords 1. However, these problems pale in comparison to the real stake in the heart of Lords 2's gameplay: its numerous stealth sequences. When will developers learn? Forced stealth sequences in games not explicitly designed from the ground up as stealth action are almost always a mistake, and Lords 2 is a textbook perfect example of why. It's difficult enough balancing the needs of giving players the feeling they're controlling a powerful individual who nonetheless still needs to not simply plow through enemies in a straightforward manner when making a stealth action game. Doing so in a game where outside of the stealth portions, that's exactly what players are called on to do repeatedly, however, is all but impossible. I loved Metal Gear Solid as much as the next guy, but that does not mean I want every game to include elements from it. That would be like me ordering a pepperoni and sausage pizza, only to find that the toppings I got instead were peanut butter and jelly. I like peanut butter and jelly a great deal, but not on my pizza. And in the same way, I don't need stealth segments in my God of War style action game. Visually, Lords of Shadow 2 is every bit as messy as the rest of the game. The often well-done designs and animations for main characters and bosses are countered by equally uninspired ones for the horde of general foes players will spend the majority of their time facing off against. And, as I previously mentioned, the cutscenes are staged about as blandly as possible. Similarly, while some environments in the game capture the fantastical gothic glory of Lords 1, far too many consist of bland alleys and other city environments that only further serve to turn what should have been one of Lords 2's greatest strengths, its modern-day setting, into a weakness. Orally, Lords 2 does fare better, with its superb yet ultimately largely wasted voice cast leading the way, and a well-composed orchestral soundtrack that does its best to make the action on screen seem more exciting than it often really is. That being said, the apparent lack of any favorite tunes from past Castlevania games was a disappointment. especially since Lords 1 included several such tracks, chief amongst which was a lovely and unique take on Vampire Killer. I'm not sure what the story behind this disaster of a game is, but I know there is one, because something this awful does not simply happen by accident. It might be as simple as the lack of active involvement of Hideo Kojima, and more importantly, Kojima Productions this time around. Or maybe Konami rushed the game out the door, or failed to give Mercury Steam the full support it needed. Perhaps management meddling forced the developers to change directions in midstream, and they never recovered as a result. Whatever the case, Lords 2 is a terrible mess of a game, whose awful ending retroactively makes Lords 1 and Klausmoth both weaker games as a result. My biggest fear is that it might also salt the earth for any future entries in the Castlevania franchise, or lead Konami to begin treating Dracula and the Belmont clan in a similar fashion to how Capcom has been abusing Mega Man in recent years. Here's hoping for a new 3DS 2D entry for the franchise sooner rather than later, because it would be nearly criminal for a series as storied as Castlevania to go out on as sour of a note as this. Score, 4 out of 10, below average. Recommendation, avoid it.